Hello everyone, I'm CrypticFox, and today we're looking at different airlock mechanisms you can build in your base and oxygen not included. Whenever you're moving from your starting biome into the other biomes that surround it, you have to contend with certain gases that you may not necessarily want in your base. When you move into the swamp biome, for example, you might have polluted oxygen that has germs in it that you don't want getting into your colony. Or when you're moving into some of the other biomes, like the purple biome, for example, you may not want to contend with chlorine gases, natural gases, or potentially hydrogen, and a few other things. When you want to try to control the gas that's contained within your base, you have to end up closing it off, and then you want to control the flow of gas in and out of your base as much as possible in order to make it the most manageable situation. In order to do that, there are a couple ways you can set up a few different airlocks to manage the gas that moves in and out. They do have the simple mechanized airlock door. However, the challenge with this is every time it opens, the gases move from one side to the other based on the gas pressure. So if you have higher oxygen pressure inside, when the door opens, that oxygen pressure will move out into the other biome, but there's a chance that some of the gas that's in there could still slip in at the lower portion of the tile. This is less than ideal if you're really trying to manage some of the things like germs or any other gases that might be out there that you don't want in there. So there are a couple different mechanisms you can use to create simple little airlocks. So we'll look at a few of them. Some of them are actually very simple and probably the way that you're going to want to go because they don't require any moving parts. They're ultimately really simple to set up, and then they're just constant and maintained. But then we also have a few other mechanical ones that are available to us now, specifically now that the automation update is out. And they're really just more for fun. But let's take a look and see what we have for different options. I'm going to be working in debug mode for speed and simplicity, but everything that we do here can be built ultimately in your game. I do try to focus on things that can be built specifically in the game as opposed to just purely theoretical items. Suppose you have a barrier with a mechanized airlock in it that separates a room full of chlorine gas and a room full of oxygen that's part of your base. If you send one of your duplicates into the other space, out of the oxygen room and into the chlorine room, there's a very small amount of gas that can pass through with them. In this case, there's just a very small pocket of oxygen that passes from the one side of the door to the other. Depending how often you cross that barrier, each time the door opens, there's a chance that the gases can move from one side to the other. In this case, it's oxygen moving back and forth, but the chlorine could also move into your colony as well. And it's not necessarily an ideal situation. Consequently, just having a simple mechanized airlock doesn't really do the best job of sealing off the gases for you. You can make this airlock more complex by building in a couple of additional doors in order to limit the risk of the gases passing through. This is fairly straightforward and easy to do. You can do it with multiple doors in a row, but the best way to do it is by putting horizontal doors in the middle, because what will happen is those doors will open and close simultaneously instead of separately. And normally when you open and close them in sequence, there's a chance of feeding additional gases through, where this way, gases that make it into the middle of the doorway will ideally be destroyed by the closing of the two doors that are horizontal. So this is a fairly simple airlock that you can make once you've researched your mechanized doors. It's maybe not the most elegant door lock, and it does have a chance still of letting some of the gases through with your duplicate as they're running through the space. However, generally it does an okay job. If you'd like to use something other than the mechanized airlock doors, and something that's a little bit more permanent, doesn't have moving parts, that sort of thing, you can build a water lock in your base that will seal off the two different areas. You do this by building a section of tile from above that extends down 2 spaces, and sections from the floor that extend down 2 spaces, and then you simply have to add liquid into this area and it will create a seal for you. The water that's in this lower area, when it gets to the right height, will ultimately adhere to this tile section that's up here. You can do this in 2 different ways. If you go into your plumbing, you can use a bottle emptier and place it. However, this is a little bit more challenging simply because of the space constraints. But you can put it right in the space itself. And once it's in here, you have to simply add bottles of water to the top of it, and as it drains, it will fill up to the point where it will ultimately connect. Alternatively, you can run in plumbing, and inside the space here, simply place your liquid vent so that you can pump water into the space, and it will fill it up to the right height, and then you'll be finished. Regardless of the option that you choose, though, what you're looking for is the water to adhere to this center block so that you create a seal that blocks the gases on both sides. This is basically a perfect seal. Your duplicates won't steal the water that's in here with the update that included the pitcher pump, so they no longer just gather water from random locations, and they can pass through without any difficulty. The one downside to using this particular walk is that when they pass through it, they end up getting a debuff called sopping wet, and unfortunately this has a negative impact on their stress. If that's not of huge concern to you, then this lock still ultimately works very, very well. However, it may not ultimately be the best choice simply because your duplicates are going to get very wet over and over again as they pass through it. You can also make a more compact version of the same airlock by using one tile high on the bottoms and then just making the same water connection in the middle. This is accomplished in the same way by pumping water into this space here in the middle. It's a little bit harder to accomplish using the bottle emptier because you have to build up some additional sides. So for example, you could build up sides like this, and that would allow you to easily pump the water in there. However, if you're looking to just build something that's very compact in this way, you could do the same thing using the liquid vent and the piping. Basically, what you're doing is pumping water into this space until the column of water builds up high enough that it adheres to this top tile. You may get some overflow over the sides, but once you clean that up, this water lock will work exactly the same way as the original one. It's just a little bit more compact, so it takes up a little bit less space in your colony. Now, it does have the same negative impact to your duplicates, though. When they run through there, they're going to get the sopping wet debuff. Another airlock you could make is one that takes advantage of the fact that gases and liquids won't try to inhabit the same tile. So if you have even the smallest amount of a substance in a tile, nothing else will try to move into it. If you build a simple little U-shaped lock mechanism like this, where the duplicate can move up and down freely, place a bottle emptier at the top, and you just have to empty a small amount of water into this space in order to create the very smallest amount that's contained in this little corner here. And so it's commonly called a corner lock. So if we have this in place, we set it for water, and then we set this to enable auto bottling. The duplicate will go and gather water from the pitcher pump. They'll bring it over to the bottle emptier, and you only need to put a tiny amount of water in this lower corner. Once you have that in place, if you just set the elemental filter to remove that, then you can mop up the remainder that's down here. And that leaves you with a little corner section here that has water in it and will stop any gases from passing through. So if we have oxygen on one side and chlorine gas on the other, you can see even though we have 2 kilograms worth of chlorine gas over here and it passes all the way down to where this little section of water is, none of the chlorine gas is getting into the space on the other side. And that's simply because this tiny little vacuum that's ultimately created by the water that's in this space and doesn't allow it to pass through. So our carbon dioxide that the duplicate 6 hailing is actually gathering just above this water, but everything below here is all chlorine gas. Now the benefit of using a corner lock like this is that when you send your duplicate through that little corner section, they don't get the sopping wet debuff. Instead, they get soggy feet, which has a slightly less impact to their stress level, while still accomplishing the same task and using the bare minimum amount of water. Another simple lock that you can create is one that actually just uses the shape of the floor and the capture of gases in order to prevent gases from moving from one area into another. So when you have carbon dioxide trapped in this lower well, just by virtue of letting the carbon dioxide that's in your colony filter down into this space, carbon dioxide is always seeking the lowest point. So it'll trap itself in this lower portion of the well and not allow it to move upwards. The chlorine tends to separate in higher layers than carbon dioxide does, so it doesn't try to force the carbon dioxide out of the way. So consequently, you can trap oxygen and chlorine gases separately with a little bit of carbon dioxide in between, and this is enough to keep the gases moving from one space to the other. Your duplicate can pass through freely, there's no doors to open or close, and there's no negative status effects that come from using this type of a lock. If you're further into your game and you have access to plastics, you could also make a door out of naphtha that allows your duplicates to walk through, but doesn't have to be opened. Melting down plastics will give you liquid naphtha, and you can place that into any kind of little storage area. Now, you might have to pump it there using a liquid pump, or maybe you just melt it in place and so that you have it in the right location. Simply add a pitcher pump to it so that your duplicates can access it. Then you're going to take a bottle emptier and place it where you want the door to be located. Set your pump to work with naphtha. Once you have your bottle emptier set specifically for naphtha, then just click on Enable Auto Bottling, and your duplicates will go and gather the naphtha from the reservoir. They'll bring it over to your bottle emptier, and they'll start to empty it. Now, it's going to take a little bit for this to build up. However, naphtha has a very strange liquid property in that it will make a stackable column. So simply by pumping the naphtha into this one location, when you get enough of it built up, the naphtha will rise up and seal off the opening and create a liquid door. You're generally going to need to empty a little more than 700 kilograms worth of naphtha into the space before it will ultimately be all finished. Once the naphtha bridges the gap, you can simply deconstruct the bottle emptier and you'll have your simple door. Now your duplicate can pass through this liquid door into the other space and it doesn't slow them down at all. It does, however, still give them the sopping wet debuff. So again, not ideal, however, it's a simple way to create a door that doesn't have anything to slow down their progress. Those are some of the simplest airlock systems you can create, and they're ultimately the ones you're probably going to use most of the time, because once they're set up, they're ready to go, and there's no additional effort involved in doing them. However, with the automation update that came out, there are some automation methods you can use to create some interesting little airlocks as well. Now, these airlocks I don't think are as good as those really basic ones, because those basic ones provide a perfect seal, and they require no maintenance. Whereas some of the automation ones, although they look really interesting and there's some cool stuff you can do with them, they ultimately have their own little downfalls as well. Let's start with a very simple one first of all. Again, we're going to assume there's going to be two different gases, oxygen on one side, and we'll use chlorine on the other side just for the purpose of example, but it could be polluted oxygen or anything else of that sort. If we set double doors on either side with a gap of three spaces in between, and then inside this space, we're going to want to put a gas pump. And from our automation menu, we're going to place an Atma Sensor. The Atma Sensor will allow us to detect everything up to the point of a vacuum inside of this gap that's in the middle. And if we want to try to prevent gases from moving from one side to the other, ideally we can create a vacuum in this middle space so that any gases that happen to enter through one of the doors will want to gather in the center area because it's the lowest point of gas pressure. So assume this is the airlock that your duplicates are going to be passing through. In order to use the automation, there's a few things we're going to want to set up. Your Atma Sensor we want connected to the gas pump, so that when it gets to a certain gas pressure, it's going to turn the gas pump on, and when it's above that certain point, it's going to turn it off. Ultimately, what we want to do is set it to 0 grams. So if it's anything that's above 0 grams, it will turn the gas pump on. If it's above 0 grams, though, we also want to lock the doors so the duplicate doesn't come in or out, so we can make sure that we're creating that seal in between. In order to do this, we're going to set a NOT gate in place. The NOT gate we're going to connect to the two inner doors inside of our little airlock. So what will happen is that if the conditions are not met for the Atma Sensor, then it's going to lock the two inner doors so the pump can go to work. For the gas pump in the middle, we'll set our simple ventilation system to go up. Now, we can do this in a couple different ways. If we want to ensure that we're sending oxygen back to the oxygen side of the wall, and chlorine back to the chlorine side of the wall, we can incorporate a gas filter in here. This isn't a necessity, obviously, because you can just simply pump all the gases into the negative space, knowing that you'll lose a little bit of oxygen each time you do that. We can simply send this out to this side, and then we'll set the filter on here to be oxygen, so it'll take any oxygen that happens to be in the space. And we use ventilation to send that over to the other side, so that we'll send oxygen to one side, and we'll send other gases to the other side. So in this scenario, if we assume we have, say, chlorine gas on this side and oxygen on this side, you can see the pump is going to work, taking the oxygen out of this space and pumping it back into the proper area over here. Once a vacuum is achieved in the middle, the doors will open, the duplicate can pass through, and then the doors will seal again in order to pump this back to a vacuum state. Once the vacuum state is achieved again, the inner doors will unlock. So this will allow the duplicates to move in and out through the door, and each time they pass through, it'll keep sealing and stopping the gases from moving through. Now, the challenge with this is there's a certain risk to duplicate life. If they pass through, and the pump that's in here is taking too long to remove the gas, you can see it's going to take generally between, in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 seconds, depending how much gas actually passes into it in order to create a vacuum state in the center. And until that can happen, the duplicate over here is going to have to hold their breath. So if you're going to use an airlock door of this nature, I would recommend setting it next to an exosuit setup so that your duplicates will at least have the exosuit to provide them with extra oxygen. But this is probably the simplest mechanized airlock system that you can use that takes advantage of some of the automation capabilities. If you're looking for a more complex airlock using the new automation system, you can try using one that uses destruction of the gases in order to try to manage the airlock instead of just trying to pump the gases into different spaces. This airlock is a little bit unreliable because while it does work, every now and then the water that makes up this particular airlock doesn't behave the way that you're expecting it to, and you'll be left in a situation where the airlock doesn't destroy the air the way you want it to. You want to start first with this kind of a T-shaped design. So you want a one space gap above some mesh tile with a two space gap for the entrance. Now this portion over here could be a larger room. In the case of this example, I'm just using a straight hallway, and then a space below the mesh that allows you to have 3 tiles. Now, when you're building this in the course of a normal game, you can't put in the mesh tile first. Of course, you'll have to build this progressively. However, we're using the debug mode just to do this quickly. We're going to set 1 door in the top horizontally, and we're going to set 3 doors turned horizontally down below the mesh to act as a pumping mechanism. This set of doors is going to be closed in sequence in order to pump water up into this space in the top. Up above, we're going to need 2 sets of doors on either side to control the airlock. Inside this space in the middle is where we're going to measure whether there's a vacuum or not. So we need an Atma sensor that we're going to place inside here. This is where the automation starts to get a little bit trickier. We're going to use a filter gate on this side in order to control the doors. Now this filter gate we're going to set to a time of 9 seconds. This doesn't have to be 9 seconds, but it might take a little bit of tweaking to kind of find something you're ultimately happy with. Basically, I want to make sure that there's enough time for the system to do what it needs to do before it will open the doors again. So what will happen is when this triggers, the Atma sensor is going to lock the 2 outside doors so that duplicants can't go in and out, and that way we don't have to worry about the water that's getting forced up being spilled out into the other 2 rooms by a duplicant passing through. Then we need a series of buffer gates in order to control everything else. This buffer gate is going to control the top door. We're going to use a series of buffer gates down below to manage these doors. These can be placed right inside the wall for simplicity. And we're going to use another filter gate to control this whole door mechanism at the bottom. So the signal that goes in here to activate the doors to tell the doors to close is going to continue up through and then down into our little filter gate down here at the bottom. This filter gate is going to feed into this buffer gate. And this buffer gate is going to trigger this door before moving on to this buffer gate, and we'll thread it back and forth. So we can control the doors in sequence. We're going to set the buffer time on this filter gate to be 6 seconds. And then these 3 doors at the bottom we're going to have set to 0.1 seconds, which is, I think, is the lowest portion, the lowest amount that you can go. And is the only number in a fraction that you can give, I think, below 1. So if you try to go like 0.5, it'll just... well, if you go 0.5, for example, it just sets it back to 0.1. So it's like you can only do like 1/10 of a second or a whole second. When this last door triggers, what we want to do is send a signal up to the top portion here to this buffer gate. And this buffer gate is going to control this door at the top, and we'll close it as well. We're going to set the time on this one to, say, 2 seconds. So I'm going to say if the gas pressure contained inside here is above 0, we want the mechanism to run. In the lower portion here, we're going to need water. Now, the easiest way to do this in a normal game is probably to put a bottle emptier here and just fill it up until the point where it's full, or to use a liquid pump and set a liquid vent here and just let it run until it's full. We want to fill up this lower portion here, but I'm going to use the debug mode to fill this up. Okay, so you have the lower portion now filled up with water. Ideally, you want it filled up so there's a little bit inside the mesh tile here at the bottom just to make sure you have enough volume of water. And this is how the door works. The duplicate will pass through the inside. It's probably not going to trigger fast enough because the Atma sensor is not fast enough to stop a duplicate while they're inside. But they'll run all the way through and get through to the other side, and the doors will seal behind them. This will trigger these doors to close in sequence, and will pump the water up into the space up in here while this door is still open. This door will then be filled with all the gases that were in here. They'll get compressed into this door space, and then when this door closes, it will destroy the gases. The Atma sensor, because it's going to be underwater, will sense that there's no atmosphere. It will then reverse the signal. The doors below will open. The water will drop back down to the lower space. This door will open at the top, and everything inside here will be a vacuum. So here we have Ren. We're going to send him through the door. We've just sent him right over to this side. He'll run through the space. The door's locked behind him. The water pumps up. It closes, creating a perfect seal. Triggers the Atma sensor to say that there's no atmosphere in that space. All the water drops back down again. Now we have a perfect vacuum inside this gap in here. No pumping required. The challenge with this particular airlock is that while it works, every now and then the water isn't going to behave the way you expect. And when the doors force it upwards, you may not get this perfect seal at the top. You may end up with a little pocket of gas stuck here. It's not so bad if the pocket of gas is on this side, because the Atma sensor will still detect that there's no atmosphere, and it will just run through it'll open up again. It'll detect the atmosphere once it's all set up. It will run through the cycle again, and then hopefully clear it out. If the pocket of gas opens up over the Atma sensor, though, the door gets stuck. You'll be stuck in a situation where it's still detecting an atmosphere, so it's keeping the whole system locked up, and it's not draining anything, but it's not able to progress forward at all. In this case, we actually got the duplicate stuck inside. Normally they can run through fast enough. Unfortunately, if they get stuck inside, they do get the sopping wet debuff. And being stuck in the space seems to negate where you told them to go. There's an example. So now we've gotten a simple case here where we've got a little pocket of carbon dioxide that's trapped around the Atma sensor here. This duplicate's going to be trapped inside this system forever. Unless you go over to the Atma sensor and you just change the setting on it. And that'll allow it to reset. Then set it back down to 0. And away you go. As an alternative to using the mechanized airlock at the top here, there is another option. You could try instead using a small pump in this space. So if you go into ventilation and use the mini gas pump, the mini gas pump doesn't move a high volume of gas. It only moves about 1,000 grams per second. And it does require power, where this entire system doesn't require any power at all in the absence of this pump. However, if you're finding that this water-based airlock isn't working consistently enough for you and you keep getting it stuck, you may want to consider using something like this. So this will still use the same basic mechanism. It's going to use the water to press up into this space in here, which compresses the gas in the top, making it accessible for the mini gas pump. The mini gas pump will then run until the gas is removed from the space. And once we've created a vacuum, the water that's in here will seal off with the Atma sensor again, and everything should go, and then it should go fine from there. This system with the mini gas pump is much slower, so you're probably going to need to adjust this particular filter gate. This is the gate that acts as a timing mechanism for when the Atma sensor detects that there's no atmosphere and sends through the signal to reopen all the gates so the water will drop back down. This one is definitely much less efficient than the scenario where you're just destroying the gas. However, it does tend to run into fewer problems where it's going to get jammed up with a pocket of gas that's going to get trapped in there. If you're comfortable risking your duplicates and having them run through that space and just using the water, you can use the other gate. However, if you're concerned that you might not be paying attention and they might get trapped in there, this might be the mechanism to go through, even though it's probably going to have to run multiple times each time a duplicate passes through. So in this example, I have oxygen on this side of the gate. We have chlorine on this side of the gate. If we take Ruby and send Ruby over to this side, you can see she passes through, it presses up, we create our seal. The water opens. Now, again, if they get trapped in the middle here when you're just telling them to move from one place to another, they abort that instruction. But if they're actually going to perform some form of action, they should still be able to pass through. These are just a few different options you could use to try to create an airlock in your colony. It is not in any way an exhaustive list. I'm sure some other people have come up with some other creative ideas. If you have some creative ideas yourself that differ from the ones that we've used here, feel free to leave a comment below and let us know what you're using for a different airlock system. But these are just a couple of ideas that hopefully will spark some ideas for you. I'm, as always, CrypticFox. I'll see all of you next time.